Kenny Pickett talked about wearing a camera at practice and during Steelers minicamp and how that's helping him study film. We talk about how that's going to impact the offense and realistic expectations for 2023. I'm your host of the Locked On Steelers podcast, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day, because we're your team every day, talking about your Pittsburgh Steelers here. Now, let's get to a few things here on how minicamp is going for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Day 2 is in the books on Wednesday. We got to talk to some more of the offensive players, and Kenny Pickett spoke. And I thought the biggest thing that we got from Kenny Pickett was him talking about the things that I think are going to be the best parts of Kenny Pickett, and that's his ability to read the field, his studious nature that makes him a well-studied quarterback. When I covered him at Pitt, he was a guy that studied every win, studied every loss, every practice, and looked for every advantage that he could get from studying his opponents, his teammates, and how to work better in various situations. And it's clear Kenny Pickett's doing just that. As at practice, he was able to talk about his ability to wear, or the Steelers planning to wear a camera on his helmet so that he could go back and review footage, not just of how the field looked from up top, but what he was actually seeing in comparison to that footage to help study with his progress along the way. Kenny Pickett talked about what that was like and how that's helping him in his film studies when we talked to him on Wednesday after Steelers minicamp practices. Now, full disclosure, this is not my footage. I actually had to cover a Pitt event during this time, so I wasn't able to talk to Kenny about it. I was able to be there in the earlier part of practice, but we have to thank our friend Alan Saunders, who was just on the last episode of SteelersNow.com, got me this footage of Kenny Pickett talking. Here's Kenny Pickett talking about the camera and the impact that it's having on his film studies as he gets ready for his second year as quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Kenny Pickett, here he is.
How weird has that been to watch that footage? Has it been helpful? Have you learned new things?
It's a little different. It's just hard to see, honestly, like through the camera, like with bodies in your face and stuff. It's different, obviously, being back there and playing. But there's some things you can take from it, kind of like where I'm starting with my eyes, pre-snap and stuff. So it's been good. Just little things. I wouldn't say too many things.
Feel a little Black Mirror-ish to have technology.
Yeah, it's a little weird. I want to put on Minkah and I can watch and see what he does that. So I hope I can dish it over to him.
How much time have you spent in the computer room, whatever you want to call it?
Minicamp. It's a little bit longer than OTAs and stuff, but whenever I need to review practice, I'm not too sure what time, but it's decent enough.
And is it sometimes hard to sort of jive in your head what you're seeing on the field, and then you go back and look at the pictures or look at the video, and from that obviously very different perspective, what actually happened from up above based on is that what that camera is kind of helping to?
Kind of, like I said, it's really hard to see sometimes. If the pockets get pushed back or something, you can't really see as well. That's why the regular tape is what I really look at the most, because I want to be able to articulate to Coach Sully what I saw, and then when I go back and watch it on tape, and it's exactly what I saw, it kind of verifies what I'm seeing. So I kind of use the normal tape about right now.
So you hear from Kenny Pickett there talking with reporters about what he's studying there. One thing to remember, and again, what I talk about a lot with Kenny Pickett, what's going to make him, if he's going to succeed and become a franchise quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers, it's not his arm strength, it's not his size, it's not his speed, it's not his quickness. It's his ability to study and to take those studies and execute on game day. To me, he is a smart, heady quarterback when he's on his best, it's because he's reading your defense and he's being accurate with the football, and he's outplaying you because he's studied you and he knows you inside and out, and he's prepared for that moment. And I think it's important that he seems to understand that, if I'm going to succeed, it's going to be because of those reasons. It's not because I'm going to, outthrow you as much as I'm going to, outwork you and outstudy you. And I think those are all good signs that he knows his role, he knows his strengths, and he's working on them even as a second-year player and even as a first-year player. I had a source close to the team tell me that even before he got the starting job, Kenny Pickett, when he was the backup and he knew that he wasn't getting first-team reps, what he would do was he would get to the Steelers facility early before all the practices, and he would he would go over all the things that they were working on, the what play they would work on, the order they would work on it. He would go over in his head. He practiced what motions that he could by himself, so that if he was called upon, he'd be ready in that moment. And that's part of why, if you remember us talking about Kenny Pickett when he was addressing like what his practice schedule was like and what it was like, in his rookie season, he was coming in when it was dark and he was going out when it was dark, because that's how much work he was putting in. And he's still putting in a lot of work. Right now he's also planning for a wedding that's happening in about a week. So congratulations to him. But I think it's very interesting to hear him going to the full degree. The Steelers have given him an office, if you didn't pick up on that part of what the conversation was, where he's able to go over film kind of in his own space, and he's got a computer that helps organize what he needs to look through. And this is a guy who, when OTA started a few weeks ago, and we had this clip on the show, he talked about how he studied OTAs of his rookie season, leading in like last year's OTAs. I mean, this guy isn't just studying game tape, he's studying his practice tape. And studying practice tape is pretty normal for those who don't know. Like, that's something that pros do, college players do. It's part of the process. But this guy was studying this year, his last year's OTAs, to understand what he needs to do smarter. And I think that speaks a lot. And he even said Minkah Fitzpatrick is there studying with him. He said Minkah's helping him because, as we've talked about, Minkah Fitzpatrick is a very cerebral player who wants to study and know more about the game than his opponents. That's a huge part of this. So I think all of this is more of a sign that Kenny Pickett is trying to fill into the identity that I think that his true potential can fit into, as far as being a cerebral quarterback who can pick the defenses apart. And I think long term, this is working this is another good sign that he can be the guy for the Pittsburgh Steelers if he really wants to be, and if things continue to work out. There's a lot of things that always get in the way. In careers, sometimes great players don't get the best launching point. But I think that Kenny Pickett's doing the right thing, and I think this camera aspect is pretty interesting. I also think that because I've seen some people out there that talk about the camera thing and like, oh man, that must mean he's bad if he needs a camera, and that's just not the case. It's actually something that's very common in the NFL. In fact, the Locked On Dolphins podcast is run by Kyle Krabs, who we've done shows with here on the Locked On Podcast Network. He also does the Locked On Scouting show with Joe Marino. Great guy, by the way, both those guys. And Kyle Krabs kind of got into this with Dolphins fans just earlier this year, some were clowning Tua Tagovailoa about wearing a camera, because he was wearing a camera in OTAs. And, they were saying like, wow, he's so bad that he needs to do that. And Kyle was like, no, that's something that a lot of quarterbacks do. And they're like, really? Probably like not the good ones. And then he like went back and found a screenshot. Here's Tom Brady doing that at one point in his career. It's just something that guys do so they can see what their sight was and line that up with what was the field like. Because, Kenny Pickett's 6'3". He's not Ben Roethlisberger at 6'5". Sometimes he might not see everything on the field at that time, and he needs to understand, like, sometimes, like, hey, when such and when Pat Freiermuth breaks up the seam, or when George Pickens hits this one route and he looks open, when we watch back practice on all 22, what was I seeing? Where was my head? How can I study where to put my eyes in the right situation so I could see the right things to cue to me, hey, I need to throw here at this time. All of those go into the studying that Kenny Pickett's doing. When you're taking all those details and putting them together, good things can come from that. It doesn't guarantee your success, but good things come from better studying like that. I want to talk more about how that's going to impact the Steelers offense and further along what their efforts are right now here in the NFL. We'll do that more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. But before we go anywhere else, I want to talk to you guys about our great sponsors at FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. The NBA Finals may be over, but Major League Baseball is in full swing right now, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And that's because right now, new customers at FanDuel get the no-sweat first bet that gives you up to $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win on FanDuel. Again, Go to fanduel.com/lockedon and sign up today to claim your no sweat first bet. And that's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Don't miss your chance at a no sweat first bet up to $2,500 back in bonus bets when you join FanDuel today. Just go to fanduel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're continuing this discussion about Kenny Pickett and the camera wearing and all the things that he's looking to make progress in. We've talked a lot about what we expect to be progress for the Steelers. And I think it's important to always check in with the Steelers about what their expectations are. And they're not going to tell you everything. They're not going to give you all the minute details of what's going to be better and how it's going to be better, unless they want to just kind of come out of the blue and say those type of things. But they're going to be vague. They're going to say certain things, and they're going to say general things that you're going to be like, well, duh, you kind of should want that to happen. But listen to Kenny Pickett when he was asked about that progress and what sort of things he was talking about his next steps as far as being comfortable in the Steelers offense and what they need to do, including what he needs to do with Matt Canada. Here's Kenny Pickett.
How much different does it feel this time around for minicamp?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, I get a lot more reps than I ever was last year. I feel a lot more comfortable being in the system the second time around, being with these guys for year two. So just, we're heading in the right direction. I feel that, so we're just going to keep showing up.
What's that evolution with Matt been like? How much you guys feel on the same page?
Yeah, it's constant, communication. That's the key, I think, between a quarterback and the OC. Knowing what he likes, knowing what I like in certain situations. In 2 minutes, it's a big deal. Understanding how he likes the flow of the game and what he usually goes with kind of really helps me out. So just that we have that constant communication, I think is what's key.
Kenny, a lot of your teammates have talked about they're perceiving you to be more active from a leadership role. Is that something that's just happening, or are you turning that on? Is there a point where you decided, all right, I'm established enough or comfortable enough that I should be doing that more?
I just feel like it's kind of like a natural transition. I don't try to force anything. I just want to step up when I feel like I need to step up. And we have a lot of great veteran guys in the O-line and young guys in the offense that are all pushing in the same direction. So I think it's definitely a group effort, but I'll step up wherever I feel it makes it.
Did you consider that responsibility of the quarterback just based on
it comes with the job. It's just, you have the feeling when you want to step up and say something, you do it. And everyone, gets the message and disrespectful towards it.
So you hear Kenny Pickett talking about quite a few things there. One, what's expected of him. Two, what he's looking forward to being. And three, also talking about Matt Canada and their experience together and how they're in constant communication. That's what's necessary for a quarterback and an offensive coordinator. And I think that shows good progress in what the Steelers are looking for from him, but they need to see it, on the finite field, not on just the practice field. But, across the board, when we talk to guys, Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, Najee Harris, all the different Steelers are saying, yeah, like he looks a lot more comfortable this year. And I think that's a huge part of what Kenny Pickett had to do this offseason was to get so familiar with the Steelers offense that he had a true command of it. And he understood where guys would be, when guys would be there, how they would be able to play. And I look back and I think about, some of the things that happened last year. A lot of the times that he made mistakes were just moments where he kind of got desperate in the wrong moments and, made mistakes in there. But as we talked about during last season, as we were covering game by game here in the Locked On Steelers podcast, he would erase those mistakes. And this was as a rookie. He would go back and he'd be like, well, I'm not going to make that throw again. I'm not going to make that mistake again. I mean, go back and look at the last drives of the Miami Dolphins game where they lost and he threw 3 interceptions. And some of those drives were in clutch moments where if he had brought it through, it would have built his legend and it would have been like, whoa, this is a different kind of guy. But he threw those interceptions. I think 2 of them came on back-to-back possessions in the end of the game where if either one of those are touchdowns, the Steelers had a good chance to win that game at the time. But he internalized that. And while it didn't save the season because that was one of the games if they had won, they would have been in the playoffs, but he internalized that. And throughout the rest of the season, you saw so many game-winning drives that he had or game-sealing drives that he had as far as what he was able to make happen, as a quarterback. You go back, you think about how the Raiders game ended, how the Ravens game ended, even how the Falcons game ended, just some of the times when he needed to step up in the moment, and he was able to do so. So, I look at what Kenny Pickett's doing and the studying that he's doing. It's important to compare it across the board because it's not just about knowing your playbook. It's knowing which parts of your playbook work best for different guys. Knowing which routes you guys are better at running, knowing where to put the ball when they're in those routes, and how that might change if there's outside leverage versus inside leverage versus zone versus man, and how different teams defend certain situations. And all of those are kind of tough to calculate right now because they don't have a general opponent that they're studying for. But this again goes back to Mike Tomlin's old phrase and the Steelers phrase that they still use to this day in the locker room, saying nameless gray faces. It doesn't matter who you're facing. You got to be prepared to be the best version of you. And I think that's where they are right now is like, hey, we'll worry about the specifics of how to defend later, but let's look at the specifics of how we can just get better in this moment. And I think that that's a huge part of what Kenny Pickett's going through right now, is trying to not necessarily worry about what different defenses are going to do to him later on, but just know that, like, hey, I am so comfortable with where my teammates are, with where I am in this offense and how there's progress being made, that I don't have to spend this time worrying outside of the organization about things that I can't control. I can study what those other teams do. I can be ready for those types of things. But again, that all goes back to still keeping in your control by studying for it. And when we talked about the offense, and we talked about this yesterday with Alan Saunders on the Tuesday episode of the Locked On Steelers podcast, or to be the Wednesday episode, when we were talking with him about it, and I was asking, like, who's the voice, who's the leader of this offense? Because the defense has several voices. You can say Cam Hayward, you can say TJ Watt, you can say Minkah Fitzpatrick, and I wouldn't say Patrick Peterson's the leader, but he's a leader, and he's going to be added to offense. There's question marks. Najee Harris, I think, is an easy target there because he's a heck of a playmaker. I think he possesses leadership qualities, and he's a guy, he loves his teammates. Like, he stands up for them a lot, and I think that's a big thing. But Kenny Pickett being a leader for the Pittsburgh Steelers, I think, is a huge part of this equation, because I think if he is able to, kind of come to the realizations of where he can be for this team and how he can best lift them up as a second-year player, I think it makes him a true weapon for the Steelers. And I think, again, when you saw Mike Tomlin's face when the Steelers drafted him, and you heard just the relief in his voice, it wasn't just Kenny Pickett's skills that he was getting. He was getting Kenny Pickett's leadership skills, his ability to study, his ability to get better. And that's something the Steelers, I think, have been very confident about when they've talked about Kenny Pickett, when they've talked about their plans for the future, is that Kenny Pickett is going to give them situations where he's going to take more smarter decisions than the average quarterback. And I'd even say the above average quarterback. And that's where I think Kenny Pickett can make a real big difference there as far as seeing the field. And again, it's not requiring him to throw 500 passes, but it is requiring him that, might need to throw 15 to 20 a little bit more often. And sometimes those 15 to 20 need to be further downfield and open up options and force tougher decisions, or tougher management decisions or schematic decisions for defenses. And Najee Harris talked about this a little bit too when we played his clip on the Wednesday show. But it's like, if the Steelers offense can stretch the field a little bit and it forces defenses to back off, the Steelers are very happy to then run the ball down your throats. And it's that balance that I think will be key to what the Steelers are trying to do in 2023. Look at me with the bars. But I want to talk to you more about that balance and those expectations numbers-wise. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare this past year's numbers to previous years when the Steelers have had some of the biggest jumps in offensive rankings in the NFL over the Kevin Colbert era from 2000 on to last year. We'll talk about that and more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Stick with us. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We'll be right back. Back here in the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. I want to talk to you guys about realistic expectations for the Steelers offense. And you've heard me say, if you're a diligent follower, if you're an everydayer on this show, first of all, we thank you for being an everydayer on this show and checking us out on our Monday through Friday platforms of podcasts and YouTube and all that. But something we've talked about quite a bit is are the realistic expectations that the Steelers have. And there's people that come in and say, Chris, they're going to the Super Bowl. And I'll be like, okay, you relax over there. Chill out. But there is reason to be excited about this team. Again, in 2022, this was a 9-8 football team with TJ Watt missing 2 months of play. And also some of those teams that they played there in that stretch were pretty doggone good, and some of them weren't so doggone good. But if they're able to not miss TJ Watt for 2 months, which was the first time they ever had to worry about him for something like that, I think they make the playoffs last year, and I think this is a better roster than last year's team. You look at the depth across the board, the offensive line, the defensive line with some of the depth that they've added there with Keanu Benton, the cornerback room with Patrick Peterson. You look at the experience that Najee Harris, Pat Freiermuth, Kenny Pickett are going to bring. Joey Porter bringing life to the cornerback room as far as a young player. There's excitement. There's promise. But again, the question is then how much can you expect the Steelers to jump up? Excuse me while I take a sip of water. But I started thinking like, okay, we've talked a little bit about how I think 16th is around the range where you want the offense to finish ranking-wise in points per game in the NFL. The offense finished last year 26th in scoring, that with 18.1 points per game. So that's where about that was. If they were to finish, 16th, right in the middle, that would have been, I believe, with right around like the Atlanta Falcons, which would be like 21.5. So roughly, you're talking about a field goal more average of points per game. And with the improved offensive line and improved Kenny Pickett and improved Najee Harris and Pat Freiermuth, and then you also throw in Darnell Washington back into that mix, I think the Steelers have some chances to make some moves up there. And again, we're talking 3 points per game. We're talking, we're talking moving up probably from like ranking in 2022. They ranked again 26th in scoring to 16th in scoring. Now that's 10 spots. That is a big jump. But historically, it wouldn't even be the biggest jump that the Steelers would have made in this era. Now it would be the second biggest jump in this. Actually, no, it would be the third biggest jump. Excuse me, I misspoke there. In over a year-to-year improvement in the offense. Now the biggest jump is an obvious one. It was when they ranked 27th in scoring in 19th and 2019, and then they finished 12th in scoring in 2020, and there was an obvious reason why, because that was the year, the 2019 was the year Ben Roethlisberger got hurt, and they had Mason Rudolph and Devlin Hodges, and 2020 was Ben Roethlisberger's triumphant return, where they won 11 games in a row, and the offense was definitely a part of that. But let's take that out of the equation there. Expecting a 15-spot jump, 27th to 12th, again, 15 spots in the rankings jump up in a single year, that's not going to happen because that was a very, very, very unique circumstance with how things played out. But I think a more reasonable jump, which could be more realistic and compared to the 2022 season and potentially the 2023, is something that happened about, I'd say, 7 to 8 years before 2019 and 2020. And that was the difference between the Steelers in 2013 and 2014. Now, in 2013, they ranked 16th in scoring offense. They ranked 12th in passing, but 27th in rushing. If you remember, that was the year that they drafted Le'Veon Bell. He had some good yards at some points, but he wasn't, he didn't have a consistent presence. Neither did the Steelers' offensive line. I believe it was also the year when Marquise Pouncey got taken out by David DeCastro when he attempted a cut block and missed and took out Pouncey's knee. I may be mistaking my year there, but it's around that time. And in 2014, things manifested for them. They went from ranking 12th in passing to 2nd in passing. But in just as big of a jump, they went from 27th in rushing to 16th in rushing. And that was with Le'Veon Bell running the ball. And also the passing part that improved was also Le'Veon Bell catching the ball. And something that we talked to Najee Harris about, he is very ready to take on more of a receiving role for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And when you talk to guys like running back coach Eddie Faulkner, they're ready to give that to him. That's something that the Steelers, I think, want to work more into. It is our natural routes for Najee Harris, not for him to just catch it at the line of scrimmage and get tackled with because there's 3 defenders on him, but for spreading this offense around, for Kenny Pickett making some plays to George Pickens and Deontay Johnson and Pat Freiermuth and other guys like that force defenses to say, all right, well, you know what? We can't invest in stopping Najee every single play, especially in the pass game. Let's just leave him with a linebacker and then let's see how he matches up. And then that's where Najee Harris can become an even bigger threat, not just in the running game, but also in the passing game. So again, when you go back to 2013 and 2014, you think about that. That was 2013 was an 8-8 season. Then 2014, they got back to the playoffs. That was the year that Le'Veon Bell got hurt the week before the playoffs, and they had to go get a backup running back off of, I think it was Ben Tate, who was on the free agent wire, and then that kind of ruined their offense in the playoffs, and they lost to the Ravens then in the first round. But again, we're talking about a rushing difference from 27th to 16th. Now, let me go over some of the rankings that the Steelers had in 2022 and where they can make those jumps. Now, in 2022, overall in scoring, they ranked 26th. So if we're even to compare that to their ranking in the 2019 season when Ben didn't play, they were 27th that year. So that's a comparison of how low they fell as far as offensively last year while dealing with Mitch Trubisky and a rookie quarterback in Kenny Pickett. But they could also jump up in how they can improve there and get into the middle groups there, because again, we're talking about jumping up 10 spots in the rankings in a single year. It's not easy to do, but it is doable. And if you go back and again look at 2013 and 2014, they jumped up from 16th to 7th, and that was about 9 spots, if I'm doing my math correctly. Sorry, I'm not a good math person, but they jumped up 9 spots in 1 year, and I think that that's a lot more realistic as far as expectations for what the Steelers can do. And this past year, they ranked 24th in passing, 16th in rushing. We've talked about the potential impact of a stronger offensive line, a more experienced Najee Harris, a 1-2 punch with Jaylen Warren, and maybe some more play action and trust given to Kenny Pickett. You see that down the board. If you're improving your passing, like 2013 to 2014, they improved by 10 spots in the rankings in passing. So let's say they go from this year from 24th to 14th in passing. In 2013 to 2014, they improved 9 spots in their rushing offense, 11 spots in their rushing offense. Let's say we'll even give it some modesty there. So in those years, in 2013 to 2014, they grew 11 spots. Let's say they grow 9 spots. They rise up in the rankings. Let's say 9 or even 8 spots. I'll give you 8 spots in rushing. That would put them in the top 10 if they were able to do that in rushing yards. And if you have a top 10 rushing offense with a passing offense that ranks around 14th or so in the NFL, that's a decent offense. That's right in the middle of what we're talking about. And if you're doing that, you're probably putting more than a field goal on more added to your score from the previous year. So you're probably adding yourself up. And again, if they just score a field goal more per game this upcoming year from the last year, they'll jump up from 26th to 16th compared to how other teams did this past season. But if they do more, like say a touchdown better, you're talking about ranking along with teams. You rank just ahead of the Minnesota Vikings, just behind the Cincinnati Bengals, because the Bengals averaged 26.1 points per game. If the Steelers added a touchdown, averaged a touchdown more per game this upcoming season, and it's ambitious, but maybe if the rushing offense can get behind it and Kenny Pickett's preparation and everything can go into that, then I think that can be a resource that leads to a jump like that puts them in not the top 10 of offenses, but this would put them, just below that. And that's right where you want to be. Because again, this is going to be a defense that is going to carry this team still. This is still a team that's going to run the ball first, pass second, and win with its defense. But the offense will be allowed to be more aggressive at times when the time calls for it. Much like how Ben Roethlisberger played in his first 3-4 years in the NFL when the Steelers had an elite defense and he was still a young quarterback learning. There were times when Bill Cowher was able to take the reins off of him and he was able to, but it was not all the time. It was few and far between because the Steelers had a really good offensive line, a really good run game, and a really good defense. Kenny Pickett is going to, I think, have a chance to be in that era. He needs the defense to be healthy and needs the defense to be great. He needs this offensive line to not just carry on the continuity they built last year, but take several steps forward along with Najee Harris, who needs to perform at that level. But if those things happen and Kenny Pickett's studying with the camera and with the extra film study and the office that they've given him, if all those things line up, I think the Steelers offense is right where you want them to be. And if they're right where you want them to be, and the Steelers defense is on point, watch out. I think this is a serious contender in the NFL. Again, not the Super Bowl, but to make it to the playoffs and to be a problem for all the teams that aren't like the Kansas City Chiefs and like the number one team in the NFL. I mean, if they're in that position, they're probably playing a wild card team or another division winner where they have a better chance to advance in the playoffs in the first and maybe even the second round. We'll get to more of that as Steelers minicamp wraps up Thursday. I'll be on hand there at the Steelers facility here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Keep up with us. We'll have another episode coming out tomorrow. Jenna Harner won't be with us, but we'll still have an episode coming out as she's going to be on vacation throughout the weekend, but we'll still be talking about your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Get my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where I cover all things Pitt athletics. Had a good story on one of the Pitt defensive linemen raising money for the local boys and girls clubs, and also you can find this show, the Locked On Steelers podcast, Monday through Friday on your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube. Thanks to everyone for checking us out. Be back on your screens and in your ears Friday, finishing up Steelers minicamp.